Welcome to Curious Case Files, where we uncover the strangest stories, the unsolved mysteries, and the most mind-bending moments from around the world. In this special compilation, we're diving deep into the cases that left us all wondering, what really happened? So grab your notepad, open your mind, and let's revisit some of the most curious cases yet.
Who are conducting an intensive investigation into the poisoning deaths feel tonight that some progress is being made in the search for the killer or killers. They are zeroing in on fewer than a dozen suspects.
Back in 1982, if you had a headache, you probably reached for Tylenol. It was that little red and white capsule, a familiar sight in medicine cabinets everywhere. Tylenol wasn't just a pill, it was a promise of relief, a symbol of trust, a staple of American life. It was considered completely safe. But on the morning of September 29th, in a quiet suburb of Chicago, that trust was obliterated. When 12-year-old Mary Kellerman woke up with a cold, her parents gave her an extra-strength Tylenol, expecting she'd feel better in no time. Instead, minutes later, she collapsed on the bathroom floor. She was pronounced dead soon after. This wasn't just a one-off tragedy. It was the first tremor of a nationwide panic, the start of a medical mystery that would change the world, and the beginning of a hunt for a new kind of killer, one who could turn medicine into a weapon. The investigation would become a maze of bizarre clues, but at its dark centre stood one man, James Lewis. He was a master of manipulation, a man of many faces, and the prime suspect in a crime he was never actually charged with. This is the twisted tale of James Lewis and the Tylenol murders, a story where the truth is far more complicated than you could ever imagine. A child's death is always a tragedy, but the shocking, sudden nature of Mary Kellerman's passing left everyone reeling. An autopsy would later uncover the horrifying truth. The Tylenol she took was laced with a fatal dose of potassium cyanide. But before anyone knew that, the invisible killer was already striking again. That same day, in Arlington Heights, another Chicago suburb, a 27-year-old postal worker named Adam Janus took a Tylenol for a minor ache. He collapsed and died at the hospital, with doctors initially blaming a massive heart attack. His family, completely shattered, gathered at his home to mourn. In their grief, Adam's younger brother, 25-year-old Stanley, and Stanley's wife, 19-year-old Teresa, both came down with headaches. Looking for relief, they reached for the exact same bottle of Tylenol Adam had used. Just moments later, Stanley collapsed and died. Teresa was rushed to the hospital, but she died 2 days later. 3 people from the same family, dead in less than 48 hours. This grim cluster of deaths was the turning point. 2 sharp off-duty firefighters, Philip Capitelli and Richard Keyworth, connected the dots. They'd heard the Janus deaths on their scanners and remembered the report about Mary Kellerman. They voiced a chilling suspicion. Could Tylenol be the link? A public health nurse, Helen Jensen, went to the Janus home and found the fateful bottle. As soon as she and investigators opened it, they smelled the faint almond-like scent of cyanide. The alarm was sounded, a terrifying pattern was emerging across the Chicago area. Over the next few days, 3 more people fell victim. Mary Reiner, a 27-year-old new mother, Mary McFarland, a 31-year-old worker at the phone company, and Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant. Every single one of them had just wanted a little relief from a common ailment. Every one of them had trusted that red and white capsule, and every one of them was dead. 7 victims, all killed by the same invisible hand. News of the poisonings unleashed a firestorm of panic. This wasn't just a local story, it was a national nightmare. Police cars rolled through Chicago neighborhoods, blaring warnings from megaphones. Do not take Tylenol. Volunteers went door to door, begging people to throw away any Tylenol they owned. The manufacturer, Johnson & Johnson, found itself in an unthinkable crisis. In what is now considered a landmark move of corporate responsibility, they issued a massive nationwide recall, pulling 31 million bottles off the shelves at a cost of over $100 million. The fear was everywhere. One of the most basic acts of trust in modern life, taking a sealed over-the-counter pill had been violated. The question on everyone's mind wasn't just who did this, but how. Investigators figured out pretty quickly that the tampering didn't happen at the factories. The poison was added after the bottles were already on store shelves. The killer, or killers, had walked into multiple stores, bought bottles of Tylenol, carefully opened the capsules, swapped the medicine with cyanide, and put the poison packages back for anyone to buy. It was a crime of terrifying randomness and chilling intimacy. The killer had no idea who their victims were, but they orchestrated their deaths with a meticulous, invisible cruelty. The hunt for this phantom killer was on, and it was about to lead investigators down a very strange path to a man who seemed to enjoy the chaos. The task force trying to catch the Tylenol killer was facing an unbelievable challenge. They had 7 victims in different Chicago suburbs with no obvious connection other than the poisoned pills. There was no crime scene in the traditional sense. The murder weapons were store-bought and the killer had left no fingerprints on the recovered bottles or capsules. With the technology available in 1982, there was no DNA evidence to look for. They were hunting a ghost. This was a new kind of criminal. It wasn't a crime of passion or personal revenge. It was remote control murder, a form of domestic terrorism that attacked the very idea of public trust. The randomness was the whole point. The killer could be anyone. Was it a disgruntled employee, a mad scientist, someone just trying to watch the world burn? The investigation became a frantic race against time. The FBI teamed up with local and state police, creating a task force of over 100 investigators. They painstakingly traced the lot numbers on the poisoned bottles, which confirmed the tampering had to have happened locally. The 5 tainted bottles they recovered came from different stores, suggesting the killer moved around the Chicago area, planting their deadly traps. The public was terrified, but also a potential source of clues. A hotline was swamped with thousands of tips. Anyone who was disgruntled, had a chemistry set, or had ever made a threat, was suddenly a person of interest. One man, a dock worker named Roger Arnold, was looked into after a bar owner told police Arnold had been talking about poisons. It turned out to be a dead end, but the stress of the investigation had its own tragic consequences. Arnold, convinced the bar owner snitched on him, later shot and killed a man he mistook for the owner in an act of misplaced revenge. The investigation was full of dead ends and false leads. Police even briefly considered if the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, might be responsible since his first crimes were in the Chicago area, but he was eventually ruled out. The case was getting colder by the day. They knew how it was done, cyanide in capsules, but they had no idea who did it, or, more importantly, why. What could possibly be the motive for something so horrible? Then, about a month after the poisonings, a letter showed up at the corporate headquarters of Johnson & Johnson. It was postmarked from Chicago, and its contents completely changed the direction of the investigation. It was a demand for $1 million. The author claimed responsibility for the murders and promised to stop the killing if the money was paid. Suddenly, the faceless killer had a voice, and that voice belonged to a man named James Lewis. The extortion letter was the first real break in the case. While it could have just been some sick opportunist, investigators believed it contained details about the crime that hadn't been released to the public, which gave it a chilling sense of authenticity. The demand was very specific. The $1 million was to be sent to the bank account of a travel agency that had gone out of business. This wasn't a random choice, and it became the first thread investigators could pull. The defunct travel agency had been owned by a man named Frederick Miller McCahey. A little digging uncovered a disgruntled former employee, Leanne Lewis. Her last paycheck had bounced, and she'd had a dispute with McCahey over her pay. And when investigators looked into Leanne, they found her husband, James William Lewis. Born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1946, James Lewis was a man who seemed to drift through life with a chip on his shoulder and a dark kind of intelligence. Police would later call him a chameleon. He used at least 20 different aliases and worked all sorts of jobs. Accountant, computer specialist, you name it. He and his wife Leanne had a daughter, Toni, who was born with Down syndrome and a heart defect. Tony tragically died in 1974 at age 5 after a surgery. Lewis himself would later claim that the sutures used in her surgery were made by a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson, hinting at a possible deeply personal grudge against the company. But Lewis's past was much darker than a string of failed jobs and personal tragedy. In 1978, while living in Kansas City, he was charged with the grisly murder of a 72-year-old client named Raymond West. West's dismembered body was found in his attic the same day Lewis tried to cash a forged check from West's account. It was a horrific crime, but Lewis walked free. The case was thrown out on a technicality. A judge ruled that police hadn't read him his rights properly. He had escaped a murder charge, but his criminal life continued. In 1981, he was convicted of mail fraud for a credit card scam. This was the man now at the top of the Tylenol suspect list. The letter was the link. Investigators tracked its origins and learned that James and Leanne had recently lived in Chicago, but had moved to New York City just weeks before the poisonings. This fact would become a major sticking point later on, but for now they were the focus of a massive nationwide manhunt. The search for the Lewises was a media circus. Their faces were everywhere. In December 1982, the hunt came to an end. A librarian at the New York Public Library recognized James from a wanted poster and called the cops. He and Leanne were arrested. Lewis didn't put up a fight. In fact, he seemed almost eager to talk. He quickly admitted he wrote the extortion letter, but he flatly denied having anything to do with the murders. His story was that the letter was just a bizarre scheme to get revenge on his wife's old boss, McKay. He claimed that by having the ransom sent to McKay's old business account, he hoped the full force of the law would come crashing down on the man. It wasn't a real attempt to get money, he said, just a convoluted plot to frame an old enemy. But as investigators kept digging, the case against James Lewis started to look a lot bigger than just one weird letter. With James Lewis in custody, the government had their man, but not for the crime everyone was talking about. They just couldn't physically tie him to the poisonings in Chicago. So prosecutors went after what they could prove, the extortion letter. In 1983, Lewis was tried for attempted extortion. His own lawyer admitted he wrote the letter but argued it was never about the money. It was a misguided stunt to point out security flaws and get back at his wife's old boss. The jury didn't buy it. Demanding $1 million to stop the killing is extortion, period. James Lewis was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, ultimately serving nearly 12. But even as he was sentenced, investigators and the public felt this was only part of the story. The circumstantial evidence pointing to him as the Tylenol killer was deeply unsettling. First, there was the letter itself. According to investigators, it contained information that suggested the author knew things about the crime that hadn't been made public. Even more damning, years later, new technology allowed investigators to enhance the postmark on the letter. It was dated October 1st, 1982. Lewis had told people it took him 3 days to write the letter. If that was true, it meant he would have started writing it before the first news reports about the poisonings even aired, which suggested he knew about it because he was the one who did it. Then there was what investigators found when they searched his things. They turned up a book about poisons, and according to law enforcement documents, Lewis's fingerprints were on the pages that specifically talked about cyanide. It was a chilling discovery that linked him directly to the murder weapon. But maybe the strangest and most incriminating evidence came from Lewis himself. After his arrest, and even from prison, Lewis seemed to love playing a cat and mouse game with the FBI. He offered to help them solve the murders. He gave them stunningly detailed scenarios of how the killer could have pulled it off. He even drew detailed diagrams, including one showing a drilled board method for quickly filling capsules with poison. He calmly explained how anybody could have done it, walking authorities through a step-by-step guide. To investigators, this wasn't some amateur detective trying to help. This felt like a confession disguised as a hypothetical. He was showing them exactly how he did it, all while hiding behind a shield of plausible deniability. It was a display of breathtaking arrogance. Here was a man already convicted of trying to profit from the tragedy, now seemingly taunting the very people trying to solve it. For many in law enforcement, there was no doubt. James Lewis was the Tylenol killer. The only problem was they couldn't prove it. Despite all the circumstantial evidence and the gut feeling of so many investigators, the case against James Lewis was never a slam dunk. For every piece of evidence that pointed to him, there was a counter-argument, a shadow of a doubt, that kept prosecutors from ever charging him with the 7 murders. The biggest problem for the prosecution was Lewis's alibi. At the time of the poisonings in late September 1982, James and Leanne were living in New York City. They had a paper trail, rent payments, job applications, placing them on the East Coast when the poisoned bottles were put on Chicago store shelves. Is it possible he secretly flew to Chicago, committed the crimes, and flew back without anyone noticing? Maybe, but it was highly unlikely and impossible to prove. Without anything placing him physically in Chicago, a murder charge just wouldn't stick. As former Chicago Police Superintendent Richard Brecek later said, James Lewis was an asshole, but he wasn't the Tylenol killer. His motive for writing the letter was also all over the place. First, he said it was to embarrass his wife's former boss. Other times, he said it was an emotional outburst. Then there was the theory about his daughter's death and a grudge against Johnson & Johnson. But Lewis contradicted his own stories over the years. This constant shifting made him seem deceptive, but it also made it hard to nail down one clear motive for mass murder. Was he a grieving father, a cold-blooded extortionist, or a narcissist whose prank went horribly wrong? Lewis's psychological profile screamed narcissist and master manipulator. He craved attention and loved feeling like the smartest person in the room. His help for the FBI could be seen as the ultimate act of hubris, a way to put himself at the centre of the biggest crime story in the country. Writing the extortion letter fits that perfectly. But does a narcissist who wants attention become an anonymous killer? The two profiles don't always match up. The Tylenol killer was a ghost. James Lewis wanted everyone to know his name. And of course, there was the total lack of direct physical evidence. In 2010, the FBI renewed its investigation, and Lewis and his wife voluntarily gave their DNA and fingerprints. He was confident, saying, "If the FBI plays it fair, I have nothing to worry about." And he was right. No matches were ever found. The lingering doubt allowed other theories to hang around. Some wondered if the tampering happened higher up the supply chain. Others thought there might be another suspect who flew completely under the radar. The case was further complicated by a 1986 copycat killing in New York, where a woman died from a poisoned Tylenol capsule while Lewis was in prison. James Lewis was the perfect suspect. He was a convicted extortionist with a dark past who loved to play mind games. He fit the part of the villain perfectly. But in the American legal system, fitting the part isn't enough. Without direct evidence and with a solid alibi, the case against him for murder remained what it always was: a compelling, deeply disturbing, but ultimately unprovable theory. While we may never know who the killer was, the Tylenol murders of 1982 permanently changed America. The random, invisible nature of the crime created a national crisis of confidence. If you couldn't trust a sealed bottle of medicine, what could you trust? The incident marked a profound loss of innocence, and the response to it reshaped an entire industry. The most visible legacy of the Tylenol murders is probably in your medicine cabinet right now. Before 1982, medications came in simple bottles, often with just a screw cap and a cotton ball inside. The crisis forced a complete revolution in product packaging. Johnson & Johnson, working with the FDA, pioneered what we now call tamper-evident packaging. Those glued flaps on the box, the plastic wrap around the cap, and the foil seal over the bottle's opening. All of that became the new industry standard. The goal wasn't to make things tamper-proof, which is impossible, but tamper-evident, so you could easily see if someone had messed with it. The law changed too. In 1983, Congress passed the Tylenol bill, which made it a federal crime to tamper with consumer products. This gave the feds the power to investigate and prosecute these kinds of crimes, which created a strong deterrent. Johnson & Johnson's handling of the crisis is still taught in business schools as a masterclass in crisis management. By immediately recalling all their products and putting public safety over profits, they saved their brand. They reintroduced Tylenol not in the easily opened capsules, but in a new solid pill called the captivate, which was much harder to tamper with. Amazingly, within a year, Tylenol was once again the nation's leading pain reliever. The Tylenol murders also left a deep cultural scar. The panic of 1982 fueled a lasting anxiety about product tampering. Urban legends about poison in Halloween candy, for instance, exploded after the Tylenol scare. The case became a permanent reminder of how vulnerable we are in our daily lives. It showed how one person's evil act could hold an entire nation hostage and fundamentally change the way we live and shop. The 7 victims didn't die in vain. Their tragic deaths sparked a revolution in consumer protection that has undoubtedly saved countless lives. After getting out of prison in 1995, James Lewis didn't just disappear. He and his wife Leanne moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and tried to build a new life, even running a small web design business. But the shadow of the Tylenol murders followed him for the rest of his life. He was always the prime suspect in the public's mind, and for many in law enforcement, he was never really a free man. He continued his strange dance with the media, sometimes giving interviews, other times lashing out. He even made a website where he declared his innocence and claimed he was framed. He was a man who seemed to both crave and hate the infamy the case brought him. His legal troubles weren't over either. In 2004, he faced serious charges in Massachusetts for rape and kidnapping, though they were later dropped after the alleged victim declined to testify. The incident just added another dark layer to his public persona. The Tylenol investigation never officially closed. It remained one of the country's most frustrating cold cases. As technology improved, investigators would periodically re-examine the evidence, always hoping for a breakthrough. In 2009, the case was formally reopened, and Lewis was, once again, the centre of attention. He gave his DNA, he did interviews, and he always maintained his innocence, always one step ahead of any real proof. Recent documentaries have brought the case back into the spotlight, featuring what would be the final extensive interview with James Lewis. In it, he was the same man he'd always been, smart, evasive, and absolutely denying any role in the killings. It was his last performance. On July 9th, 2023, James Lewis was found dead in his Cambridge home at the age of 76. An autopsy confirmed he died of natural causes. No foul play was suspected. His death brought an end to a lifetime of suspicion, but it offered no real closure. For the families of the 7 victims, it was a frustrating end to the story. The man they believed was responsible for their loved ones' deaths died a free man, taking his secrets with him. For the investigators who chased him for decades, his death closed the book on their prime suspect, but it didn't solve the case. The Tylenol murders remain to this day officially unsolved. So what do you think? Was James Lewis the mastermind behind the Tylenol murders, a cold killer who taunted the police for decades? Or was he just a twisted opportunist who got caught in a web of his own making and spent a lifetime under a cloud of suspicion he created himself? Let me know your theories in the comments below. And if you want to dive into more unsolved mysteries that changed history, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next video. The story of the Tylenol murders is more than just a true crime story. It's about trust, fear, and how a single evil act can change everything. 7 innocent people, Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, Stanley Janus, Teresa Janus, Mary Reiner, Mary McFarland, and Paula Prince lost their lives because they reached for a remedy. Their deaths sparked a nationwide panic, but they also created a legacy of safety that protects us to this day. And at the centre of it all was James Lewis, a man who will forever be defined by a crime he was never charged with. Was he the phantom killer who terrorised a nation, or just the loudest voice in the chaos? With his death, the full truth may never be known. The case files are still open, a chilling monument to one of America's most infamous unsolved mysteries. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we can't see, and the most disturbing questions are the ones that never get answered. There are some stories that just stick with you, the kind of unsolved mysteries that are so strange, so deeply perplexing, they seem to defy any rational explanation. They linger in our minds, not just because they're unsolved, but because the few clues left behind only make the puzzle more confusing. Few cases capture this feeling more than the chilling disappearance of 5 best friends, a group of young men who vanished into the cold mountain air after a night out. Their car was eventually found abandoned on a remote, snow-covered road, but that was only the first chapter in a story that would grow stranger with every single discovery. In one of America's most baffling unsolved mysteries, 5 best friends vanished after a late-night basketball game. Their car was found abandoned on a remote mountain road with a series of bizarre clues left behind. But the strangest part, they seemingly had everything they needed to survive, yet 4 of them perished in the wilderness, and 1 was never seen again. This is the strange and tragic case of the Yuba County 5. To even begin to unravel the mystery of what happened in the cold darkness of the Plumas National Forest, you first have to understand the men themselves. They weren't just a group of guys, they were a unit, a band of brothers known affectionately to their families and community as the Boys. They lived in and around Yuba City, California, a tight-knit community in the Sacramento Valley. The 5 men, Gary Mathias, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jackie Hewitt, and Ted Wire, were bound by a deep and genuine friendship. Each of them had faced their own challenges in life. 4 of the 5 men had mild intellectual disabilities, while Gary Mathias was managing a schizophrenia diagnosis with medication. Many of them had solidified their bond while attending a local day program for people with mental disabilities. But those challenges didn't define them. Their lives were full of routine, work, family, and most importantly, their shared passion for sports. Jack Madruga, 30 years old, was the unofficial driver and caretaker of the group. A proud Army veteran, he was seen as the most grounded and responsible. He loved his car, a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego, and kept it in pristine condition. His mother later said he was protective of it and would never have let anyone else drive it, nor would he have ever abandoned it lightly. Bill Sterling, who was 29, was Jack's best friend. He was deeply religious, a gentle soul who often spent his free time at the local library, checking out books and talking with the librarians. He was quiet but steadfast, a calming presence in the group. At 24, Jackie Hewitt was the youngest. Described as childlike and incredibly trusting, he was particularly close to the oldest member of the group, Ted Wire. Ted Wire, 32, was perhaps the most sociable and outgoing of the 5. He had a job as a janitor and was known for his friendly demeanour, always stopping to greet people he knew. He was a creature of habit, and his family knew his routines down to the minute. Any deviation was highly unusual. Then there was 25-year-old Gary Mathias. Also an Army veteran, Mathias was the one member of the group who stood slightly apart. He'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia during his time in the military and was discharged on psychiatric disability. By 1978, though, his family and doctors believed his condition was well managed with medication. He was part of the group, but he also had a life outside of it, with his own family and a job at his stepfather's gardening business. Their shared love of basketball was the centerpiece of their social lives. They played on a team sponsored by the day program they attended, and they were good. So good, in fact, that they were just 1 win away from qualifying for a free week-long trip to Los Angeles for the Special Olympics. That qualifying game was set for Saturday, February 25th, 1978. It was the most important thing on their horizon, what they talked about constantly. The night before that big game, on Friday, February 24th, they decided to drive about 50 miles north to Chico to cheer on the UC Davis basketball team. It was a celebration, a night out for the boys before their own moment in the spotlight. Their families saw them off, never imagining it would be the last time. The evening of Friday, February 24th, 1978, started with the kind of buzz and excitement that comes before a big event. The 5 men piled into Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego, their chariot to freedom and adventure. They drove from their homes in Yuba City and Marysville to the campus of California State University, Chico. They watched the game and by all accounts had a great time. The home team lost, but it didn't seem to sour their mood. After the game ended around 10 p.m, their journey took its first seemingly innocent detour. Instead of heading straight back south to Yuba City, they stopped at a bear's market in downtown Chico. The clerk working that night remembered the group vividly. She said they came in close to closing time, full of energy. They bought a bunch of snacks: a Hostess cherry pie, a Hostess lemon pie, a Langendorf lemon pie, a Snickers bar, a Marathon bar, and cartons of milk and Pepsi. The clerk recalled them being polite and cheerful. It was a small detail, but one that investigators would later puzzle over. This stop at the market is the last confirmed sighting of the Yuba County 5. They got back into the Mercury Montego, snacks and drinks in hand, and drove off into the night. The 50-mile drive home should have taken about an hour. They were expected back before midnight, especially Ted Wire, who was known for being on time. When midnight came and went, his mother started to worry. When Saturday morning arrived and none of the men had come home, a quiet concern began to ripple through their families. This was completely out of character. These weren't men who stayed out all night without telling anyone. They had routines, and most of all, they had their big basketball game that day. There was no reason they would miss it. They'd been so excited. Ted Wire had even asked his mother to wash his uniform and lay it out for him. He had brand new sneakers ready to go. The idea that they would voluntarily skip this game was unthinkable to everyone who knew them. By Saturday afternoon, with still no word, the family's concern turned to panic. They called the police, and the 5 men were officially reported missing. The search began right away, but police had almost nothing to go on. They focused on the most logical route, the main highway between Chico and Yuba City. They scoured the roadsides and checked with hospitals and law enforcement in neighbouring counties, but found nothing. No sign of a crash, no sign of the Mercury Montego, no sign of the men. It was as if the car and its 5 passengers had simply been erased somewhere between the market in Chico and their homes in Yuba City. For 3 agonising days, their families waited, and the mystery only deepened. For days, the search yielded nothing. The families and police were baffled. How could a car with 5 people inside just vanish from a major road? The answer, when it finally came, was more bewildering than anyone could have imagined. It turned out they weren't anywhere near the main road. On Tuesday, February 28th, a ranger with the Plumas National Forest was driving along a remote, high-altitude service road when he spotted something out of place. There, partially stuck in a snowdrift, was a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. It was Jack Madruga's car. The location was the first major shock. The car was found nearly 70 miles from Chico, high up in the mountains of the Plumas National Forest, at an elevation of about 4,500 feet. This wasn't just a wrong turn, it was a journey deep into a desolate, winding and dangerous wilderness area. The road was unpaved, treacherous in the best conditions, and at this time of year it was buried in snow. To get there, they would have had to drive an hour in the complete opposite direction of their homes, up a steady, climbing mountain path in the dead of night. The condition of the car only added to the puzzle. It was stuck in the snow, but not badly. Investigators believed 5 healthy young men could have easily pushed it free. There was no damage to the car, suggesting it hadn't been forced off the road or been in an accident. The doors were unlocked, one of the windows was rolled down. Inside, the scene was eerily normal. Wrappers from the snacks and empty cartons of milk and soda were sitting on the console. A California road map lay open on the front seat. But the most perplexing detail of all, the car had more than a quarter tank of gasoline, plenty to have gotten them off the mountain and all the way home, and the keys were gone. This discovery shattered every simple theory. They hadn't crashed, they hadn't run out of gas. For some inexplicable reason, they had driven deep into a snowy, isolated forest, stopped the car, and then walked away from it, abandoning their only source of shelter and their only means of escape. Why? The question hung heavy in the freezing mountain air. Why drive up here in the first place? The road led to nowhere, petering out further up the mountain. It wasn't a shortcut. It was a logging road, used infrequently in the summer and practically abandoned in the winter. And why leave the car? It was their lifeline. The temperature at that altitude would have been frigid, and a brutal snowstorm was descending on the Sierra Nevada mountains that very night. To leave the safety of the car to venture out on foot into a blizzard seemed like a death sentence. The discovery of the car didn't provide answers. It only created a cascade of new, more disturbing questions. The men were still missing, but now their last known location was a place they had no reason to be, under circumstances that made no sense. The search now had a focal point, but it was in a vast, unforgiving wilderness. And as the storm rolled in, burying the area under feet of fresh snow, the search had to be called off. The fate of the Yuba County 5 would remain a mystery, buried under the winter snows, waiting for the spring thaw. For months, winter held the secrets of the Plumas National Forest. The snow piled up, making any real search impossible. The families of the 5 men could do nothing but wait and hope. It wasn't until early June 1978, as the thick blanket of snow finally began to melt, that the forest began to give up its dead. The first discovery was made on June 4th. A group of motorcyclists exploring the area stumbled upon a US Forest Service trailer, a remote outpost for workers, nearly 20 miles from where the car had been abandoned. The trailer was supposed to be locked up for the winter, but one of its windows was broken. Peering inside, they were met with a horrific sight. On a bed, wrapped tightly in 8 sheets like a mummy, lay the emaciated body of a man. It was Ted Wire. The scene inside the trailer was a paradox. An autopsy would later determine Wire had died of starvation and hypothermia. He had lost nearly 100 pounds, and the growth of his beard suggested he had been alive for 8 to 13 weeks after the disappearance. But here's the tragedy. In a storage shed next to the trailer was a locker filled with enough canned food to have kept all 5 men alive for weeks. The propane tank that supplied gas for heating and cooking was also full. All someone had to do was turn a valve and use a can opener, but the food remained untouched, the heat unused. Wire had starved and frozen to death in a place that offered him salvation. The clues found with his body only deepened the mystery. His wallet with cash inside was on a table. A gold watch, a gift from his family that he never took off, was also there. Robbery clearly wasn't a motive, but his leather dress shoes were missing. In their place, in a corner of the trailer, were a pair of tennis sneakers that belonged to Gary Mathias. This discovery electrified the investigation. It proved at least 2 of the men, Wire and Mathias, had made the nearly 20-mile journey from the car to the trailer, but it raised more questions. Why didn't they use the supplies? The cans could have been opened with a P38 can opener that was in the trailer, a tool familiar to army veterans like Mathias and Madruga. Were they unable to figure it out? Was Wire left alone in the trailer? Did Mathias take his shoes and leave him behind? 2 days after finding Wire, search parties combing the area found more grim discoveries. About 11 miles from the car, they found the skeletal remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling on opposite sides of the road. Madruga had been partially scavenged by animals. He was still clutching the keys to his beloved Mercury Montego. Sterling's bones were scattered over a small area. It seemed they had succumbed to the elements long before Wire did. A day later, searchers found Jackie Hewitt. His own father was in the search party that found his son's spine under a bush about a quarter mile from the trailer. His skull was found a short distance away. 4 of the 5 men were now accounted for. They had all died tragic, lonely deaths in the wilderness. But 1 man was still missing, Gary Mathias. The only trace of him was his tennis shoes, left behind in the trailer with Ted Wire's body. Despite one of the most extensive search efforts in California history, no other sign of Gary Mathias was ever found. His fate remains the central, unresolved question at the heart of this tragedy. For over 40 years, this case has been picked apart by investigators and armchair detectives, yet we're no closer to a definitive answer. The few facts we have refuse to fit together into a coherent picture. The entire case rests on a foundation of baffling questions. First, why did they drive up that mountain? They were just an hour from their warm beds, with their basketball uniforms laid out for the most important game of their lives. The road into the Plumas National Forest wasn't a simple wrong turn, it was a deliberate hour-long drive in the wrong direction. One theory is they were following someone. A darker theory suggests they were lured or forced up the mountain against their will. Second, why abandon a perfectly good car? The Montego was their only shelter from an impending blizzard. It had gas. It was only mildly stuck in a snowdrift that 5 men could have likely cleared. To get out and start walking 20 miles deeper into the forest in the dark suggests a powerful motivating force. Was it fear? Did an encounter with someone on that dark road scare them so badly they fled on foot? This is where the story of Joseph Shones comes in. Shones told police he'd driven up that same road on the night of February 24th to check the snow levels for a family ski trip. His car also got stuck. While trying to free it, he felt the warning signs of a heart attack and got back inside, keeping the engine running for heat. Later that night, he heard whistling. He saw a group of people, including what he thought was a woman holding a baby, and heard them talking. When he called out for help, they went silent and turned off their flashlights. His story was inconsistent, making him an unreliable witness, but if he did see something, it could point to foul play. Did the boys stumble upon something they weren't supposed to? And then there's the trailer, the most confounding part of the mystery. Why did Ted Wire and Gary Mathias not use the food and heat that were right there? One theory is fear. If they were being chased, maybe they thought a fire would give away their location. Another possibility is that their cognitive disabilities, amplified by trauma and stress, left them unable to figure out how to use the supplies. But that seems unlikely for Mathias, an army veteran familiar with sea rations and tools like the P38 can opener found in the trailer. This brings us to the final haunting question. What happened to Gary Mathias? He had schizophrenia. Did his mental illness, perhaps triggered by the stress of being lost, play a role in the group's bizarre decisions? Did he experience a psychotic episode? Some have speculated that Matthias, in a state of delusion, might have convinced the others to leave the car. In the trailer, he left his own shoes and seemingly took Wire's. Why? Was he trading up for sturdier footwear? Did he abandon Wire, or did he leave to find help, only to perish somewhere in the vast forest? Without his body, we can only guess. His family held out hope that he might have somehow survived, but most investigators believe he too died on that mountain, his remains simply never found. The theories swirl, but none can account for all the facts. The case is often called America's Dyatlov Pass, another mystery where a group died under inexplicable circumstances in a snowy wilderness. In both cases, the victims' final actions are so contrary to survival instincts that they invite endless speculation. In the end, what we're left with is a story without an ending. A story of 5 friends, 5 sons, 5 brothers who went out for a night of fun and never came home. 4 were found, victims of the cold and the wilderness, under circumstances that defy easy explanation. 1 vanished completely, leaving behind only his shoes and a giant question mark that hangs over the entire case. The story of the Yuba County 5 is more than just an unsolved mystery. It's a story about friendship, vulnerability, and how quickly a night of joy can turn into an incomprehensible tragedy. The snows have melted and returned to the Plumas National Forest more than 40 times since that night in 1978, but they have never revealed the final answer. The truth of what happened on that lonely mountain road remains locked in the silence of the forest, a silent testament to one of America's most profoundly strange and heartbreaking unsolved cases. The case of the Yuba County 5 remains officially open. What do you think happened on that mountain? Share your theories in the comments below. I'm standing on the edge of the Black River, and if you didn't know any better, you'd swear we were in a postcard. The moonlight is skimming the water, the pines smell like Christmas, and the only sound is the river doing what rivers do, slip by without a fuss, carrying its secrets downstream. But here's the twist. Under that pristine, placid calm is a history so grim the national papers once ran it above the fold. Between 1885 and 1900, this tiny isolated lumber town stacked up more suicides, murders, and diphtheria deaths per capita than anywhere else in Wisconsin. Locals, in a moment of bleak poetry, called it the Wisconsin Death Trip, and they weren't being dramatic. So tonight, we're up here on the bluffs where the worst of it went down, asking the question that still hangs in the air like river fog. Did the horror ever truly end? Before anyone even thought to mutter the word ghost over a supper of hard bread and salted pork, Black River Falls was the spot you bragged about in letters back home. It was the American dream, rendered in timber and ambition. Picture this: white pine logs choking the river, a forest so dense you could walk across its surface, a sudden gold strike that had prospectors tripping over one another with wild, feverish eyes, and a brand new two-story skating rink that smelled of fresh varnish and possibility every Friday night. Electric lights, a modern marvel, flickered on Main Street before most of the Midwest even knew what electricity was. For a handful of intoxicating years, it felt like the future had punched a hole through the Wisconsin wilderness and decided to camp right here. Then, as quickly as it began, the bottom fell out. The gold petered out into useless shale, and the price of pine nosedived. The great mills slammed their doors shut. The music at the rink went silent as it turned into a dusty warehouse, and the opera house started selling chicken feed just to keep the lights on. Families who'd bet everything on town lots woke up one morning holding slips of paper worth less than the matches they struck to read them by. That was the first crack in the foundation, a tremor of the ruin to come. The second crack came wearing diphtheria like a winter coat. They called it the Strangler, and it rode in on the rasping coughs of children. The kind of cough where parents, exhausted and isolated, still think a cool breeze and a fervent prayer will be enough to fix it. Atta, just 5 years old, with her whole life ahead of her, was the first to go, her breath catching in her throat in a little clapboard house that wasn't nearly warm enough. 3 days later, her little brother followed her into the frozen ground. By the end of that bitter month, 32 children were gone. Their faces were immortalised by the town photographer, Charles Van Scheck, captured on glass plate photos with eyes far older than any child's should be. After the sickness had its fill, starvation marched in right behind it. Potatoes froze solid underground, the cows forgot how to give milk, and the banks, once beacons of the town's prosperity, started knocking on doors like grim carolers, waving ballooned loan papers. A $50 note from a hopeful spring could swell to $300 by winter, and when the money finally ran out, the newspaper headlines became a litany of despair. Another desperate act. Farmer burns barn and self. The Victorian language is quaint, sure, but the terror screaming between the lines is still raw enough to cut you. Mary Sweeney had been a school teacher until the diphtheria epidemic emptied her classroom. After that, something in her snapped. She began to drift through the streets after dark, a gaunt figure in a long black coat, a flat iron heavy in her pocket. She would walk until she found a window that caught the moonlight just so, and then she would smash it, finding some terrible satisfaction in the sound. They'd lock her up at dawn, and with nowhere else to put her, turn her loose by supper. Every night, she'd find another pane to shatter. She told the sheriff the glass screamed when it broke, that she could hear babies crying from inside it. In 1896, they shipped her to the Mendota Asylum. The official records say she died of melancholia, which is just old-time speak for a mind that walked off a cliff and never came back. George Wilson's story is shorter, but somehow louder. When the bank slipped the final foreclosure notice under his door, he didn't say a word. He hitched his 2 best horses to a heavy stump puller and began dragging it uphill to the bluffs. Neighbours watched, thinking he was trenching for a late potato crop. Instead, he found a spot, packed the hole with dynamite, laid his horses down beside him as if to comfort them, and lit the fuse. The blast rattled windows in Merrill, 20 miles away. Of George and his team, all they ever found were a few twisted horseshoes and a single empty boot. The crater is still up there on the bluff, a deep scar in the earth where nothing grows in the middle, though a ring of young saplings surrounds it like quiet onlookers at a funeral. Then there's the story of the cop woman. The papers, in a rare moment of discretion, never gave her a first name. She was found in her bare kitchen with her newborn son. The coroner's note is a heart stopper, just 2 lines of cold, official script. Mother stated she feared the child would starve, so she spared him that fate. She served 10 years in Waltham prison, her days spent stitching altar cloths in silence. The day she walked free, she headed straight for the Black River. Kids nowadays, walking the riverside path, swear that sometimes a woman in wet shoes trails them, her mouth open in a cry that makes no sound. When you stack that much misery into just a few square miles, folklore shows up whether it's invited or not. It started as whispers. Grandmothers, huddled by the stove, spoke of the bluff hag, a tall, skeletal thing in rotting lace who'd trade you a favour for a secret you hadn't told another living soul. Loggers, coming off the camps, half mad from isolation and cheap whiskey, talked about strange lights that would slide uphill against the wind and voices that hollered their names from the dark mouths of sandstone caves. They swore on their mothers' graves that the diphtheria kids would gather to play Ring Around the Rosie at midnight, their laughter sharp enough to cut. Nobody wrote it down at first. These stories just swapped hands like germs, each teller adding a new, chilling wrinkle the last one missed. After a while, the stories took on a life of their own. Even the sheriff's horses, animals with no sense of history, began to balk at the trailhead after dark. Fast forward a century and Black River Falls looks like any other sleepy Midwestern town. The coffee is from a gas station and the bait shop opens at 5 AM. But the old stories don't take hints, they linger. The Van Schaik photography studio is a one-chair barbershop now, and the owner, a man who doesn't believe in ghosts, swears the bell above his door jangles when no one has walked in. He keeps a meticulous log in a ledger. Tuesday, 3:47 PM, Saturday, 11:02 AM. The bell's clapper needs a solid push to ring. There's no string, no cross breeze, no prank-playing kids in sight. Up on the bluffs, where lovers carve their initials into the trees, teenagers still dare each other to walk past the second great oak. They come back down chalk white and breathless, swearing they heard a woman's voice softly counting 1 potato, 2 potato, and saw footprints that stride right off the edge of the cliff and simply vanish into thin air. But the most stubborn story of all is that of the river bride. Show up just after a hard rain when the river is swollen and brown, and they say you might spot her. She stands knee-deep in the churning current, with tangled river weeds for a veil and a fistful of wilted cowslips. She always faces upstream, as if waiting for something. Locals who remember the story of the cot baby, whose burial blanket was said to be stitched with a pattern of cowslips, feel their stomachs drop every time they hear it. The newspaper archives, the asylum ledgers, the glass plate photographs of the dead, they all ratify an era when death kept the books and hope was a line item no one could afford. And here, on these same bluffs, in these same woods, people still feel the temperature plummet, hear bells ring themselves and see footprints that stop cold in mid-air. Is it all just a form of collective memory, a town's trauma baked into the very sandstone, or are the victims of that terrible time still here, still waiting for someone to notice they never really left? The bluffs don't hand out neat answers, they just hold their breath and watch you walk by. So, now it's over to you. Have you ever hiked these trails and felt an inexplicable tug on your sleeve? Have you ever heard a voice that doesn't belong to any living throat? Drop your story in the comments below. Let's keep this memory bright and loud. Sometimes the only way to settle a haunted place is to just keep talking about it. If this one left a chill down your spine, hit that subscribe button. There are plenty more forgotten corners of the Midwest and more rivers that have kept their secrets. We'll meet you on the next bank. In the heart of Texas lies a stretch of land with a chilling name, the Killing Fields. For over 5 decades, this desolate corridor along Interstate 45 has been a hunting ground. Dozens of girls and young women have vanished here, their lives cut short by murder. Who is responsible for the I-45 killings, and why, after all this time, have they never truly been caught? It's a question that haunts the soul of the Lone Star State. Interstate 45 stretches 51 miles between Houston and Galveston. a journey through refinery stacks, strip malls, and swampy pine forests. For most, it's a simple commute, but for investigators and heartbroken families, it's a sprawling crime scene. Since 1971, the tally of victims has climbed relentlessly. More than 30 young women have either disappeared or been found dead, their last known locations often just a stone's throw from the I-45. The faces change, but the pattern remains. Vulnerable girls, often caught in difficult circumstances, were targeted and then discarded. The highway earned a local nickname, the Highway to Hell. It's a place where everyday journeys can end in unimaginable tragedy, leaving a trail of grief and unanswered questions. The terror began in November of 1971. Colette Wilson, just 13 years old, stepped off her school bus, waved goodbye and vanished. Months later, her body was discovered near a bayou. She had been shot in the head. The community was stunned. Weeks after Colette's discovery, another young life was stolen. 14-year-old Brenda Jones disappeared while walking to a babysitting job. Her remains were later found on a Galveston beach. By 1974, headlines whispered of a possible maniac, but the term serial killer was still considered too sensational for the time. The cases weren't connected by a terrified public or the authorities. Each girl was a standalone tragedy, not yet recognised as part of a larger, sinister mosaic. This left the killer free to continue unseen by a fractured system. Fast forward to 1983. The bedroom community of League City, just south of Houston, was booming, but just off the main road, a dirt path named Calder Road snaked through a rugged, forgotten corner of the countryside, past horse pastures and rusted pump jacks. One day, a dog walker noticed something pale against the dark bark of a tree. It was Heidi Fye, a 23-year-old bartender who had vanished months earlier after using a payphone. Her body lay naked, her arms meticulously folded across her chest, as if she had been posed. Detectives descended on the scene, but the trail went cold and the file on Heidi Fye's murder slipped to the bottom of the pile. They had no idea this same patch of brush would eventually give up the remains of 3 more women. 16-year-old Laura Miller lived just a mile from where Heidi Fye's body was discovered. The story unnerved her, yet one night she walked to that same payphone to call her boyfriend. Laura never came home. Search parties combed the fields. Laura's father, Tim Miller, begged police to search every inch of Calder Road, convinced his daughter was there, but they told him a father's gut instinct wasn't enough evidence to justify such a massive search. 2 agonizing years crawled by. Then, in February of 1986, Laura's remains were found less than 50 yards from where Heidi Fye had been discovered. The scene was sickeningly similar, the same posture, the same nakedness. The community stopped using the word coincidence. This was a pattern, this was terror, and for Tim Miller, it was the beginning of a lifelong crusade for justice. With Laura Miller's discovery, detectives could no longer deny they were dealing with a serial killer, but the tools to catch such a monster were, by modern standards, primitive. DNA science was in its infancy. They had bones, hair, and not much else. Then, the fields off Calder Road gave up 2 more secrets. One body surfaced in 1986, just months after Laura, and another in 1991. Both women were found posed in the same ritualistic way, naked, arms folded, and tragically, both lacked any identification. For 3 decades, they were known only as Jane Doe and Janet Doe, silent witnesses to a predator who stalked the edges of civilization. Then, in 2019, a breakthrough came from forensic science. A technique known as genetic genealogy offered new hope. Parabon Nanolabs took on the challenge, running genetic profiles on the degraded samples and building family trees to find a match. And it worked. The nameless became named. Jane Doe, found in 1986, was identified as Audrey Lee Cook, a 30-year-old mechanic who had lost touch with her family. Janet Doe, discovered in 1991, was Donna Gonsolan Prudhomme, a 34-year-old mother fleeing an abusive relationship. Donna was last seen at a bar along I-45. Audrey was last spotted at a convenience store off the same exit. Both were vulnerable, and both may have accepted a ride from a stranger. The families finally had burials and names to etch on headstones, but the killer remained nameless. The Calder Road clearing is just one patch in a much larger forest of sorrow. The I-45 corridor is a grim mosaic of disappearances and deaths that paint an even more disturbing picture. Between 1979 and 1983 alone, at least 7 teenagers vanished from the seawall in Galveston. In 1985, 13-year-old Crystal Jean Baker was found strangled beneath a bridge. In 1996, 12-year-old Laura Smither went for a jog in her Friendswood neighbourhood and never returned. Her body was later found in a retention pond. The tally climbs to over 30, and likely many more. These cases span different jurisdictions, handled by different police departments, yet they all share that same ominous corridor. The common denominators are stark: youth, femininity, and that relentless ribbon of asphalt that is RC45. It's a pattern that screams for answers and for an end to the terror. Over the decades, names of potential suspects surfaced, but the path to justice has been riddled with dead ends. Edward Bell, a convicted killer, boasted from prison of 11 little Heidi's, a grotesque reference to Heidi Fye, but he died before he could be definitively linked to the murders. Michael Self, a Galveston bar owner, confessed to some of the crimes, but then recanted, claiming police coercion. The case against him crumbled, and he died in 2000. Clyde Hedrick owned property near Calder Road, but DNA tests failed to connect him to the killings. Investigators were left with fragments, partial profiles, tyre tracks, and a single boot print. What they've always needed is that one person who remembers something, whose secret might finally unlock decades of torment. Why have these cases remained unsolved? It's a perfect storm of systemic failure, geography, and neglect. The I-45 corridor cuts across 4 counties, and in the early days, dozens of siloed police departments failed to share information. Physical evidence, often collected without modern protocols, sat degrading in hot, humid storage units for decades. We also can't ignore that many victims' working-class families lacked the resources to demand sustained media and police attention. And finally, there's the geography itself. The region, with its swampy terrain and countless oil roads, was a predator's dream. Bodies could vanish for months or years. By the time remains surfaced, witnesses had moved away or died. The killer bet on the slow decay of evidence and memory. For decades, that bet paid off. But Tim Miller, Laura's dad, refused to let his daughter be forgotten. His grief transformed into action. He founded Texas EquiSearch, a volunteer search and rescue organisation born from his personal tragedy. Since its inception, EquiSearch has become a nationwide beacon of hope, locating hundreds of missing people. Every time another young woman disappears in that cursed corridor, Tim Miller is there, strapping on a flashlight, his face etched with decades of determination. "I refuse to let my daughter be a cold case," he says. It's more than a statement, it's a vow. His personal tragedy has been transmuted into a powerful legacy, ensuring the world remembers. Advances in forensic genealogy mean the next genetic match could finally break these cases. The technology is evolving at an incredible pace, allowing scientists to work with even smaller, more degraded samples of DNA. In 2022, the League City Police Department resubmitted trace evidence to Othram Labs, a private lab specialising in solving the unsolvable. Quietly, detectives have also been collecting new DNA swabs from persons of interest to build a comprehensive genetic picture, eliminating suspects and identifying potential family links to the killer. Murder has no statute of limitations. Investigators believe the killer is still out there, likely between 60 and 80 years old now, probably still living locally. He's someone's neighbour, someone's relative, and someone, somewhere, knows something. If you grew up along the Gulf Coast, think hard. Did you know someone who was obsessed with the Calder killings? Did a relative or friend act strangely? Did you hear a rumour, a whispered name, or a detail that fell off? Any tiny flicker of memory could be the key. Please don't dismiss it. Call the League City tip line. The links are in the description. Your small piece of information could be the final puzzle piece that gives these women the justice they deserve. Drive down Calder Road today and you'll see new subdivisions swallowing up the old fields. Kids ride scooters where, not so long ago, bones lay hidden. It's a surreal contrast between the vibrant present and the terrifying past. Yet, the earth itself seems to resist forgetting. After a heavy rain, the soil still pushes up poignant reminders, a sherd of a jeans button, a rusted shoelace grommet. They are the earth's receipts, proof that secrets lie buried just beneath the surface. The killer may believe that time has buried his secret, but DNA does not forget, and neither do fathers. The land remembers, the science remembers, and the relentless pursuit of justice ensures that the memory of these women will never fade. More than 50 years of grief and unanswered questions line the I-45 corridor. Heidi, Laura, Audrey, Donna, and dozens more, their names echo in the wind. Their families toast empty chairs at holidays, forever wondering what might have been and what evidence might still sit in a forgotten box. The Texas killing fields are not an abstract story. They are a stark ledger of unfinished justice. Until the names of the murdered are matched by the name of the murderer, every mile of that highway will remain a question mark. If you know something, please say it. Speak before the next young woman trusts the wrong smile on a lonely Texas night and becomes another name on the killing field's tragic roll call. 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper boards a Northwest Orient Airlines Boeing 727 in Portland under calm yet mysterious circumstances. Less than 3 hours later, he swaggers off the plane, or so it seems, only to vanish into the night. He had just pulled off one of the boldest skyjacker heists in US history and disappeared completely. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the strange disappearance of D.B. Cooper. A man, mid-40s, wearing a business suit and dark JC Penney tie, pays cash for a one-way ticket. He settles into seat 18C, orders a bourbon and soda. All seems ordinary. Around 3 p.m, he hands flight attendant Florence Schaffner a note. "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase." Her eyes go wide. She notices the red wires and electronic components in the attaché case. He demands $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes. Safe exit assured. At Seattle-Tacoma, a frantic scramble begins. Law enforcement arms themselves with 2 spares. 4 chutes arrive. Cooper releases 36 passengers in exchange, but he keeps the crew. The plane wheels away, bound for Mexico City, with a refueling stop in Reno. The FBI launches NORJAC, Northwest Hijacking, in mid-flight. Within days, the FBI compiles evidence. The cheap tie removed before parachuting provides DNA opportunities. 1 chute was instructional and sewn shut. He used 2 and left 2 unused. The canvas ransom bag was tied with parachute cord. They interrogate hundreds of suspects, over 800 leads by year 5. No conclusive match, only a few persons of interest. Fast forward to 1980. A small pack of $20 bills worth $5,800 washes ashore near Vancouver, Washington. Ransom serial numbers match. But what of the rest? No trace. Not one more bill enters circulation. In response, airlines install Cooper vanes to lock the aft stairs in flight. Metal detectors and baggage screenings begin the same year. A costly but lasting legacy. Despite searches in the Washougal watershed and forested routes, investigators find nothing. Many analysts conclude Cooper perished during the jump. Navigational errors, bad jump conditions, inadequate clothing and boots, and terrain that ate him whole. So who was the mysterious hijacker in seat 18C? The FBI followed every crumb. Let's dive into the most popular and bizarre theories about who D.B. Cooper might have been and what happened to him after the jump. This is the FBI's official position. D.B. Cooper perished somewhere in the wilderness of southwest Washington that night. Consider this, he jumped at night into freezing rain with no helmet. He wore a suit and loafers, not exactly skydiving attire. The terrain was dense woods, rivers, steep slopes, no obvious landing zones. He used a reserve chute that was non-functional, likely without his knowledge. Add to that, the money wasn't spent ever. That suggests it never left the forest floor. The stash found in 1918 may have been carried downstream, an eerie breadcrumb from a failed escape. But there's a problem. Despite exhaustive searches, no body, no parachute, no gear, nothing. Then there's the popular counter theory. D.B. Cooper survived and pulled off the perfect crime. Could he have planned his landing? Maybe he was ex-military, trained in parachuting and survival. Maybe he even had an extraction plan waiting near the drop zone. Let's talk suspects. In 1972, just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, Richard McCoy, a Vietnam veteran and skydiver, hijacked a Boeing 727 in an almost identical fashion, demanded $500,000, jumped with a parachute, escaped mid-flight. The FBI caught him shortly after. McCoy always denied being Cooper, but many investigators suspected otherwise. Even his facial features bore a resemblance to Cooper's sketch. But McCoy was in Utah during the Cooper jump, and his family had alibis. In 1995, on his deathbed, Dwayne Webber allegedly told his wife, "I'm Dan Cooper." After his death, she searched his belongings and found a note. A Northwest Orient flight ticket stub. Notes scribbled in French. A 1971 knee injury, possibly from a hard parachute landing. She contacted the FBI. For years, Weber was considered a top suspect, but DNA from the tie didn't match, and no solid evidence tied him to the crime. Christensen was a former paratrooper and Northwest Orient Airlines employee. He even bore a resemblance to the composite sketch. After his death in 1994, family members claimed he had a stash of money and told them cryptic stories. But again, no physical proof. This theory suggests Cooper was familiar with Boeing 727s and Northwest flight routines. He knew the aft stair could be lowered mid-flight, the precise cruising altitude to open it safely, what to ask for in parachutes, even how to select a stormy night to minimise aerial surveillance. Could he have worked in aviation? A military insider, a rogue pilot? We may never know. Then there are the more speculative ideas. D.B. Cooper was a CIA asset, performing a covert operation that went rogue. He escaped to Mexico or South America, living under a new name. Some even suggest he was Canadian, drawing from the Dan Cooper comic series popular in French-speaking Canada. Cooper's alias matched the comic's hero, a paratrooper with wild adventures. Coincidence or subtle signature? Whoever he was, Cooper left a legacy few criminals ever achieve. In the public's eye, he wasn't a menace, but a folk hero. He didn't hurt anyone. He was polite, even apologetic to the flight crew. He drank bourbon, smoked cigarettes, and vanished like a legend from a noir novel. D.B. Cooper has inspired films like Without a Paddle, The Pursuit of D.B. Cooper, and even a shout-out in Loki, where Loki himself is revealed as Cooper. Songs, books, comic books, and at least a dozen documentaries. Annual CooperCon conventions still draw fans and amateur sleuths. He's the ultimate American mystery man, a gentleman outlaw who beat the system. In 2016, the FBI closed the case after 45 years. Norjack was shelved. The official line, no new credible leads. But new clues and whistleblowers continue to surface, suggesting we haven't heard the last of Cooper just yet. What kind of person pulls off a crime like this and walks away forever? Well, he was methodical but calm. He wasn't greedy. $200,000 was a reasonable sum, even modest for a heist. He was prepared but not arrogant. He read people, controlled the crew without force. Some psychologists speculate he was ex-military, perhaps disillusioned, possibly terminally ill, or simply someone who wanted to vanish from society on his own terms. So, did D.B. Cooper die in the storm, money scattered to the rivers and trees, or did he survive, watching from afar as his myth grew, until a body is found, or the rest of the money surfaces? We may never know. The case of D.B. Cooper remains the only unsolved skyjacking in US history, and perhaps that's the way he wanted it. What do you think? Was D.B. Cooper a genius rogue who beat the odds, or just a desperate man who got lucky? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive, give us a like, subscribe for more mysteries, and hit the bell so you never miss an episode. Until next time, keep your eyes on the sky and your bourbon neat. Can you solve the Lake Bodom murders? Wind sighs through the pines. A tent zipper clicks shut. 4 teenagers laugh over the last of the cocoa. Sure, the worst thing they'll see tonight is rain on the canvas. By sunrise, 3 of them will be dead. The 4th will wake up with shattered bones, no memory, and a lifetime of whispers trailing behind him. Tonight we're rewinding to the longest, coldest night in Finnish crime history, Lake Bodom, June 1960. 64 years on, the file is still stamped open, and every Finn can point to the lake on a map and tell you where they were the first time they heard the story. We'll pace the shoreline, flip through yellowed folders, and meet suspects the courts could never quite convict. By the end, I'll ask the same question that's haunted 3 generations of detectives. Can you solve the Lake Bodom murders? Grab something warm, coffee, or something stronger, and let's start where it only makes sense to start. Espoo, just west of Helsinki, 1960. Post-war Finland's finally feeling flush. Teenagers clip transistor radios to their belts, and every long June weekend, the pine forests around Lake Bodom fill with tents, smoke from little saunas, and the smell of grilled makara sausages. Maila Emeli Björklund and Anja Tuulikki-Mäki, 15, inseparable, are practically glowing because their boyfriends, 18-year-olds Seppo Boisman and Niels Gustafsson, have borrowed a tent and 2 lukewarm beers. Picture dust tipping the lake the colour of old pennies, mosquitoes humming, the girls carving MA plus SB into soft pine with a pocket knife. They've got scratchy Beatles singles on low volume, enough chocolate to survive until sunrise, and that bulletproof optimism you only have at 15 when the sky never really gets dark. The tent closes just after midnight. The air's warm. The only sound is water licking the rocks. Nothing feels dangerous. Everything feels possible. A little before 11 the next morning, a carpenter named Esko Johansson cuts through the woods on a shortcut to the job site. He smells smoke, then spots the tent, collapsed like a broken bone. Inside, 3 bodies. Maila's been stabbed more than 30 times, clothes disturbed, body dragged just outside the canvas. Seppo and Anja lie tangled together, skulls bashed in, knife wounds across their torsos. On the grass, Niels Gustafsson, alive but barely, jaw hanging loose, skin split like overripe fruit. Blood soaks the ground. The first officer on the scene later admitted he thought bear attack until he saw the neat, straight cuts in the tent wall, clean slices made by something human. Let's unpack what the crime scene actually told investigators once they peeled their eyes away from the horror. Murder weapons never found. We know only that both a sharp blade and something blunt and heavy were used. Rocks the size of grapefruits litter the place. Any could have done the job. Tent fabric, sliced from the outside in as if someone wanted the teens trapped. Missing items, wallets, watches, a leather jacket, and oddly, Niels's shoes. They turn up weeks later, stuffed under a root 500 metres away. Time of death? Coroner pins it between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. Witnesses, 2 bird watchers, saw a blonde man in a light jacket strolling calmly from the campsite around 6:05 a.m. Neither rang police until they heard the news later that day. From minute 1, the scene was a mess. Curious locals trampled footprints. A reporter lit a cigarette inside the tent, and someone walked off with Maila's diary. Chain of custody didn't exist. In 2024, we'd call it a forensic nightmare. In 1960, it was just rural policing. Niels Gustafsson spent weeks drifting in and out of hospital consciousness. When he surfaced, he had no memory of the attack. None. He remembered zipping the tent. Next thing he knew, hospital ceiling tiles. Finnish papers screamed, "Did Niels do it?" The theory was tidy, jealous fight over Maila, explosion of violence, then self-inflicted wounds to throw police off the scent. Doctors weren't buying it. Niels had a fractured jaw, severe concussion, defensive cuts on his forearms. Try stabbing yourself 30 times and knocking your own face sideways. Possible, sure, but you'd need the grace of an Olympic gymnast. Still, suspicion stuck to him like pine sap. 44 years later, detectives would dust off the rumours and haul Niels back into the spotlight. Every cold case collects a rogues gallery. Bodom's is weirder than most. 14 years old in 1960. Violent record even by juvie standards. In 1969, he supposedly bragged to cellmates he'd done those kids at Bodom. He hanged himself before police could interrogate him properly. No physical evidence, no eyewitness. Just a jail yard confession that could be the worst kind of boasting. Hans Assmann, German-born labourer living nearby. On the morning of the murders, he turned up at Helsinki Surgical Hospital, clothes flecked with blood, under his nails what looked like dried lake mud. Doctors noted he seemed twitchy. Then he produced a dance hall alibi, claimed he'd been in a fight the night before, and the blood was from a nosebleed. Case closed on Assmann, but rumours linger because, honestly, who shows up at a hospital covered in blood right after a triple murder? The unidentified blonde man. 2 witnesses, same description. Tall, light hair, light jacket, walking away at dawn. Police never found him. Years later, a local teacher insisted she'd seen a man matching that description, washing blood from his clothes in a stream. No name, no follow-up. The random drifter theory. Finland in 1960 still had plenty of men drifting from logging camp to logging camp, carrying knives and grudges. Could have been a robbery gone sideways, except nothing of real value was taken. Watches were cheap, wallets nearly empty. Whoever it was seemed to want to hurt, not profit. Let's be kind and say Finnish police in 1960 weren't used to homicide on this scale. The lead detective, a man named Heiha, later admitted they didn't even own a Polaroid. They sketched by hand and taped labels to tree trunks. Locals wandered the site eating sandwiches. A reporter pocketed Myla's broken glasses as a souvenir. By the time lab techs arrived the next afternoon, any useful tyre track had been ground to mush. Result? No fingerprints, no clear footprints, no murder weapon. Just blood types, a B and O, and a vague sense that whoever did this knew how to vanish in a forest full of people. Decades on, Lake Bodom became Finland's Amityville. Parents used it as shorthand. Don't camp alone, remember Bodom. Bands named themselves after the lake. Horror movies filmed there. Every midsummer, someone swears they hear screams across the water. The tent pegs are gone, but the story sticks like campfire smoke in a wool sweater. Who do you think was in those woods at 5 a.m? Niels, the jealous boyfriend, a teenage psychopath, or a stranger who melted back into the pines? I read every theory, and the best ones might make it into the follow-up episode. Fast forward to 2004. Cold case detectives, now armed with DNA kits and 40 years of hindsight, reopen Bodom. They re-examine Niels's clothes stored in an evidence box. Tiny blood spatter patterns, microscopic fibres, a few drops that didn't match his own type. In March 2004, police knocked on Niels' door. He was now a 62-year-old bus driver living quietly in the suburbs. They arrested him for triple homicide. Headlines exploded. Survivor or slaughterer? Finland stopped for the trial. Prosecutors pushed a jealous rage theory. Niels saw Mela flirting with Seppo, snapped, killed everyone including his best friend, then staged injuries. They paraded blood pattern analysts, forensic psychologists, and a mannequin wearing Niels' 1960 shirt. Defense shot back. The injuries were too severe. A self-inflicted fractured jaw would have required surgical precision while concussed. They hammered on the missing murder weapon, the blonde man, the contaminated crime scene, and after 11 months, the district court acquitted Niels, citing reasonable doubt. The state paid him €44,000 compensation for the year he spent in custody. He walked out free, but the whispers followed. If Niels did it, how did he inflict such damage on himself? If someone else did, why leave the sole survivor alive, and why hide his shoes half a kilometre away? And the blonde man, red herring, or the ghost Finland never caught? Every answer spawns 2 new questions, which is why Bodom still sells newspapers whenever a new witness comes forward. None ever has. there's a new walking path, a memorial stone with the victims' names, and a metal grill where families laugh the same way those teenagers did in 1960. At dusk, the pines creak, and you realise the forest hasn't forgotten. Tour guides point across the water and drop their voices. Some nights locals swear they see a single flashlight bobbing among the reeds, probably just kids playing ghost hunters, probably. Myla, Anya, Seppo, their lives stopped the moment the tent walls ripped open. Niels lived, but in a lot of ways, he stopped that morning too. Every June, someone leaves fresh flowers on the memorial stone. The card usually reads, "We still remember," because memory's all that's left when justice stalls and evidence rots in cardboard boxes. So tonight, when you crawl into your sleeping bag, zip it tight and think about the unsolved. Remember Lake Bodom. 3 teenagers never got there tomorrow. 1 man got too many. And somewhere in the dark between those 2 facts, the killer walks free. Can you solve the Lake Bodom murders?